The official story says the Weimaraner was a 19th century German invention. But that story is a lie. New ancient DNA analysis, consistent with findings published in journals like Nature regarding early European dog lineages, proves the truth is much older and stranger. We've finally uncovered the hidden lineage behind the silver ghost, and the evidence doesn't match the history books. Let's look at exactly what the science reveals. By the time the breed began to gather its modern shape, the answer was already hiding in plain sight. It was not one single dog, not one clean line, not one pure beginning. It was a careful convergence of hunters' tools, each one bringing a different gift into the same frame. Bloodhound, English pointer, German short-haired pointer, the blue dog, and the Hühnerhund all belong to that older pattern of making, where function mattered first and appearance followed only after the work was proven. That matters, because it changes the whole mood of the origin. A dog with a nose like a thread pulled through dark grass does not appear by accident. A dog built to move fast across open ground does not carry that speed by chance. And a dog that later became known for its silver-grey coat was not simply painted by time. It was shaped by a set of selections that kept useful traits and narrowed the rest. According to Petfinder's public breed profile, this 19th century blending is one of the reasons the Weimaraner came to embody such an unusual combination of hunting power and visual sharpness. The bloodhound brings a specific tracking instinct. As noted in studies of canine ancestry, these traits are not accidental, but part of a shared genetic history of European hunting dogs. The English pointer adds a different sort of tension, a body made to find and freeze game in place. The German short-haired pointer sharpens that balance, giving the impression of a dog that can think while it moves. Then there is the blue dog, a name that sounds almost like folklore until it is placed inside the breeding logic of the period. And the Hühnerhund, the poultry dog, which reminds us that hunting stock was often built from practical local needs, rather than from any grand design. What emerges from that mix is not a decorative animal borrowed for a courtly room. It is a working machine made of living parts, and every part leaves a trace. The far too elegant outline, the pale coat that looks almost metallic in certain light, the alertness that seems to sharpen the air around it, all begin to read differently once those ancestral pieces are placed side by side. The animal no longer looks like a sudden invention. It looks assembled, and that is where the tension deepens. If the breed's identity can be traced to so many contributors, then the question is no longer simply who named it or where it was first kept. The real problem is how a mixture that broad became so unified. How did a collection of hunting influences, each with its own purpose, fuse into a single profile that feels so unmistakable now? That transformation implies selection strong enough to erase clutter but not strength, to standardize form without flattening instinct. This process highlights a deliberate editing of the breed, a common practice in the 19th century standardization of hunting dogs, where function was the primary selective pressure. There is something almost unsettling in that process. Human hands were not only preserving a line, they were editing it with care. They kept what worked in marsh, field, and forest, and they discarded what did not serve the hunt. Over time, the result became so distinct that people later mistook coherence for simplicity. Yet coherence is often the final stage of a much messier history. A body can look unified and still carry the memory of many crossings beneath the surface. So the silver coat is not just a visual flourish, and the scenting nose is not just a charming trait. Together, they are evidence. They point back to an era when breeders were trying to solve a problem, not create a symbol. They wanted reach, endurance, presence, and control in one animal. The breed that would eventually be admired for poise was first valued for utility. That is the first crack in the old assumption, and once it opens, more light begins to enter. Because if these strands were truly mixed in the 19th century, then the next question becomes harder and more interesting. Which of those older dogs left the deepest mark? Which one shaped the temperament that made the dog so responsive in the field, yet so exacting in close human company? And if the coat, the nose, and the body all came from different ancestral pressures, what else in its nature is still waiting to be recognized? There is a moment in this history when the floor seems to move under everything that came before. The elegant grey dog, so often described as a product of careful 19th century shaping, suddenly stops looking like a modern invention and starts looking older, more layered, almost inconveniently persistent. Because the trail does not begin where the polished version says it should. According to the Weimaraner Club of America's breed history page, the Weimaraner is one of Germany's oldest dog breeds, with records of dogs resembling it appearing as far back as the 17th century, long before the form we recognize today was fixed in the 19th. That single shift in timing changes the whole silhouette of the story. What seemed like a breed born from refinement now looks like a breed refined from something already there. And that changes the meaning of every detail people thought they understood. The narrow head, the disciplined frame, the way the dog seems to gather itself before it moves, the controlled intensity in its eyes. None of that has to be explained only by recent breeding programs. It may also be the visible endpoint of a much longer continuity, one that survived hunts, changing tastes, and generations of practical selection. The modern Weimaraner did not emerge from a blank slate. It arrived wearing the final shape of older pressures. That older presence matters because it interrupts the neat story told by origin dates. In Germany, dogs with a similar outline were already part of the landscape, while the aristocratic ideal of a versatile hunting companion was still only one layer of a broader canine reality. By the time the 19th century arrived and breeders began stabilizing type, they were not simply creating a new animal. They were narrowing an existing one, bringing a long, useful inheritance into sharper focus. The result looked sudden only because the earlier stages had been spread across time, and time is often the best disguise. Once that is understood, the question becomes less about where the Weimaraner was made, and more about what was preserved inside it. What exactly passed through the centuries unchanged enough to be recognized later? Was it the pace of the body, the sensitivity to human direction, the instinct to search with relentless concentration, or a deeper combination of all three? A breed that appears so complete can be deceptive. Completeness often hides assembly. The 17th century records do more than push the timeline backward. They expose a contradiction at the center of the breed's identity. If dogs like this were already present in Germany long before the official image hardened, then the modern Weimaraner is not just a story of creation. It is also a story of preservation, interruption, and editing. Somebody selected, refined, and named what had already been living in plain sight. That makes the next question harder to avoid. If the breed was ancient before it was standardized, then what did those earlier dogs look like in daily use? Who depended on them? And for what work? The answer is likely buried not in the pose that later made the Weimaraner famous, but in the rougher world that shaped its first purpose. And once that world comes into view, the refined surface of the breed begins to look less like a beginning than a conclusion that arrived centuries late. The change did not begin in a kennel. It began in the field, where a dog that had been built for power suddenly found the ground shifting under its feet. For generations, the Weimaraner had been valued for confronting large game in Germany. Bears, wild boars, deer, animals that demanded nerve, speed, and a body capable of holding its line when the encounter turned dangerous. But that world thinned out. The quarry changed. The old work became harder to find. And when the big animals declined, the breed did what surviving working dogs always do. It adjusted. According to the breed history presented by the Weimaraner Club of the Western Association, the Weimaraner was redirected toward foxes, hares, and birds as the 19th century unfolded, and the landscape of hunting in Germany changed. That sounds simple, but it is a much sharper clue than it first appears. A dog does not switch tasks cleanly unless the people around it keep demanding usefulness. The body remains, but the test changes. The same frame that once had to press through brute force was now expected to track lighter, quicker targets with precision and patience. That shift helps explain something the elegant image alone can never fully capture. The Weimaraner's endurance was not preserved because it looked noble. It was preserved because each generation had to earn its place by staying effective. A hunter who needed a dog for foxes could not keep a dog that moved like a relic. A hunter working for hares and birds needed a mind that could reset quickly, read scent without hesitation, and stay locked in even when the chase broke into fragments. The breed's famous concentration begins to look less like refinement and more like pressure made visible. This is where the story becomes more unsettling, because adaptation can make a breed appear newly designed, when, in fact, it is simply being bent again by necessity. The Weimaraner did not lose its earlier strength when the hunting target changed. It learned to aim that strength differently. And that raises a more interesting question than the one about origin alone. How much of the breed's identity was shaped not by what humans admired, but by what they still needed from a dog that had to keep proving itself in a narrower world? Seen that way, the silver coat and clean outline are only part of the picture. Underneath them sits a harder inheritance, a working animal repeatedly narrowed, redirected, and kept alive by utility. The Weimaraner became what it is because the world around it stopped offering the same battles and still expected the same performance. That tension between fading game and stubborn purpose is what pushed the breed forward. And once that is understood, the next layer appears almost immediately. If the dog was being remade by changing hunting needs, then who decided which traits had to survive, and which ones could be left behind? There was one feature people kept noticing first, and then never quite forgot: the Weimaraner's grey-silver coat, paired with amber eyes that seemed almost lit from within. It was not a decorative accident. By the 19th century, that color had become the breed's signature, the detail that made it instantly recognizable in a field, in a kennel, or at the edge of a hunting party. The American Kennel Club still describes that coat as a defining trait, a result of heredity and selection over time, and that simple fact changes the meaning of the dog's appearance. Because the coat was not just admired, it was remembered. It became part of how people identified the dog before they even knew its name. A hunter in Germany could spot the outline and the pale sheen at a distance. A breeder could see, in that silvery surface, a line worth keeping. And once that happened, appearance stopped being mere appearance. It became evidence. It told a story about what had survived, what had been preferred, and what had slowly been fixed into the breed's identity. The eyes mattered too. Amber did not blend into the background the way darker eyes often do. They caught light differently, and that gave the Weimaraner a look that felt alert, even when the body was still. Together, coat and eyes formed a visual code that separated the dog from other working breeds. Not because the dog was fashionable, but because its body carried a pattern that humans recognized as useful, beautiful, and memorable all at once. As confirmed by the 2011 study in the Journal of Animal Breeding and Genetics, the blue coat color is not a spontaneous mutation, but a specific genetic inheritance linked to the TYRP1 haplotype. That is the part people often miss when they talk about elegance. They describe the Weimaraner as refined, almost aristocratic, as if its beauty had simply been chosen from a catalogue. But the grey-silver coat points to a much harder truth. Traits do not become iconic by remaining accidental. They become iconic because someone notices them, values them, and keeps them in circulation. In this breed, the visible surface and the working purpose were never far apart. The coat helped define the animal, but it also helped preserve it. And there is something even more interesting hidden in that. A distinctive color can do more than identify a dog. It can protect a lineage from drifting too far from itself. Once the Weimaraner's silver tone was tied to recognition, it began to function almost like a warning and a promise at the same time. This is the dog you think you know, and this is the dog that has been deliberately kept that way. The result was a breed whose image became inseparable from its genetics. People did not merely see a working dog with a pale coat. They saw the coat and understood the breed through it. That is why the Weimaraner never looked interchangeable, even when other hunting dogs shared similar jobs. Its appearance gave it a public identity, before science could explain the inheritance behind it. Long before DNA offered the deeper timeline, the body itself was already speaking. If you watch the dog closely, the coat is not flat gray, it shifts. In stronger light it can seem almost metallic. In shadow, softer and colder. That changing surface helped turn the Weimaraner into something more than a record of function. It made the breed visible as a presence, not just a tool. And once a breed becomes visible in that way, human choices intensify around it. People breed for the trait, praise the trait, remember the trait. A single visual marker can pull a whole lineage into focus. So the silver coat and amber eyes are not the end of the story. They are the moment the story becomes readable from a distance. The Weimaraner did not simply inherit an elegant look. It acquired a form of recognition so strong that the look itself began to shape the breed's future. And that raises the next question with a different kind of weight. If the visible signature was being preserved so carefully, what else was being guarded beneath it, hidden inside the same line of dogs that kept returning with the same impossible color? The surprising part is not that the Weimaraner was fast. It is how far that speed still reaches. According to the American Kennel Club's expert advice page on the breed, this dog is known for intense energy and a real need for exercise, enough to keep pace with marathon runners and to compete in agility sports. That detail changes the entire picture. A dog built only for short bursts would fade once the hunt ended. A dog with this kind of stamina carries a different inheritance. Not just pursuit, but endurance. That is why the old image of the Weimaraner as a polished hunting companion never quite explains everything. A body able to run for miles, turn sharply, recover quickly, and stay alert under pressure points to a deeper design. It suggests a breed shaped for long hours, changing terrain, and decisions made in motion. In other words, the brilliance was not only in the nose or the speed. It was in the refusal to break down when the work became repetitive, physical, and exhausting. Seen that way, agility is not a modern hobby pasted onto an old dog. It feels like an echo. The same frame that could move with hunters through difficult ground could later slice through poles, jumps, and tight turns with startling ease. The Weimaraner does not merely tolerate demanding sport. It seems to remember it. And that memory matters, because it shows how selection can preserve more than appearance. It can keep a working rhythm alive long after the original task has changed. There is something almost unsettling in that continuity. The dog that once had to hold itself together in the field now carries the same disciplined power into marathons and competitive courses. The setting is different, but the demand is familiar. Stay focused, stay efficient, stay ready. That kind of physical intelligence does not appear by accident. It is what remains when generations are chosen for usefulness under pressure and then refined until the body itself becomes a kind of living instrument. For a long time, people admired the Weimaraner because it looked noble. But a noble look is only the surface of a larger answer. Under that surface is a creature built to keep going when others slow down, to think while moving, to remain attentive when fatigue should have won. The elegance is real, but it is backed by something tougher and stranger. An athletic constitution that makes sense of the whole lineage. And if that endurance was being protected all along, then the next question becomes harder. What kind of life had to exist in the breed's past to require such stubborn reserve of energy? What sort of work makes a dog not just beautiful or obedient, but almost impossible to wear out? The answer lies deeper than the hunt everyone remembers, in the pressures that shaped the line before anyone gave it a famous name. In 1897, the story stopped being only a matter of memory and became a matter of record. In 1897, the breed's formal history was codified with the formation of the Verein zur Züchtung des Weimaraner Forstehundes, ensuring strict pedigree control. In Weimar, a group of breeders founded this association, and that step changed everything. What had circulated as a practical hunting line, shaped by use and reputation, now entered a system of names, entries, and inheritance. The dog was no longer discussed only by the way it moved through fields or the way it worked beside hunters. It was being fixed on paper, one generation at a time. That sounds like a bureaucratic detail, but it was much more than that. Once pedigree became the language of the breed, every choice carried a different weight. Which animals were allowed forward, which were left behind, which features were treated as essential, and which were quietly erased. The modern Weimaraner was not simply recognized in that moment. It was narrowed, curated, and protected, as if someone had decided that the past itself needed guarding. Zooplus notes that this association was created specifically to establish pedigree records and promote selective breeding, and that description matters because it reveals a turning point. Before 1897, the line could still breathe with a kind of looseness, passed along through work, preference, and local judgment. After 1897, it became a project. A record can preserve, but it can also define. It can save a lineage from disappearing, and at the same time, decide what that lineage is allowed to be. That is where the Weimaraner's history becomes stranger. The earlier mystery was whether the breed was truly ancient or simply made to look that way by later admiration. The registry answer does not cancel the older story. It reframes it. The documents did not create the dog from nothing, but they gave shape to something that had been fluid for centuries. A living line became an official one, and that shift changed the breed's future more than any single trait ever could. From that point on, the question was no longer only what the Weimaraner could do. It was what the breed was permitted to remember. A pedigree is not just a family tree. It is a filter. It tells the future which past to repeat and which past to leave in silence. And once that filter was in place, the consequences reached beyond appearance. Breeders were no longer merely keeping a useful hunting companion alive. They were deciding how closely the dog should resemble the ideal written down in a new century, how much variation could survive, and how much of the old working line would remain visible in the new official type. The Weimaraner did not lose its history in that process. It became more legible, but also more fragile. That is the deeper twist. The registry was never just about order. It was about survival through definition. In Weimar in 1897, people did something subtle and powerful. They turned a moving tradition into a protected identity. And once identity is written down, it can endure in ways the original workers never imagined, while also becoming easier to narrow, polish, and claim. So the elegant dog seen today carries two kinds of inheritance at once. One was built in fields and forests, through function and selection. The other was built at a desk, in a founding meeting, through records, pedigree, and intent. The first made the breed capable. The second made it official. And maybe that is why the Weimaraner still feels larger than a simple breed history. It is a reminder that the moment humans begin to record life, they do more than describe it. They choose what survives as truth. The dog kept running. The paperwork caught up. And from that point forward, the breed belonged to both the hunt and the archive, to motion and memory, to flesh and form. By the time the Weimaraner crossed the Atlantic, it was no longer a local secret hidden inside German fields. It had become the kind of dog people could recognize at a glance, trust in motion, and carry with them as proof of a standard that had already survived its own trials. That mattered, because the next chapter did not begin in Weimar. It began in the United States, where hunters and enthusiasts brought the breed across an ocean and helped turn its reputation into something international. The American Kennel Club made that transition official in 1943. Lancaster Puppies notes that recognition clearly, tying the breed's entry into the American system to a moment when the Weimaraner had already shown it could stand on its own. It was no longer an experiment in preference or a curiosity from abroad. It had reached the point where an established kennel authority could read its structure, its purpose, and its consistency as the mark of a real breed. In that sense, 1943 was not just a date. It was confirmation. What changed in that recognition was deeper than paperwork. A dog that had once been guarded as a selective German tradition now had to prove itself in a wider world, among different climates, different uses, and different expectations. Yet the Weimaraner did not arrive as a blank slate. It came carrying the discipline of its past, the stamina, the responsiveness, the field sense, the unmistakable body language that made it useful long before it became admired. The United States did not invent those qualities. It inherited them. And once the AKC accepted the breed, the Weimaraner entered a new kind of life. Recognition gave it visibility, but visibility also created pressure. The dog that had been shaped by function now had to remain legible to standards, breeders, and owners, far from the place where its story had been assembled. That shift helped secure its future, but it also changed the terms of belonging. The breed was no longer carried only by memory and practice. It was carried by documents, show rings, and the growing idea that a dog could represent a national lineage while still belonging to the world. That is why the American chapter matters so much. It shows that the Weimaraner was not preserved by staying still. It was preserved by moving. It left Germany not as a fading remnant, but as a complete identity strong enough to survive translation. Hunters brought it because it worked. Enthusiasts kept it because it was unforgettable. The AKC recognized it because, by 1943, it had already become stable enough to fit within a formal American framework, without losing the core that made it distinct. Seen from that angle, the breed's history becomes almost paradoxical. The same qualities that made the Weimaraner a product of careful German selection also made it exportable. Its precision became portability, its reputation became currency, and its image, so carefully shaped over time, finally crossed into another country and returned with something new, proof that the line was no longer regional. That is a powerful ending to the first great arc of the Weimaraner's story. Ancient DNA explained the depth of its roots. German breeding explained its refinement. And the 1943 AKC recognition showed something else entirely, that the breed had entered the modern world with enough coherence to be carried, classified, and admired beyond the borders that formed it. The Weimaraner did not simply travel, it arrived as a finished presence. Maybe that is what makes the breed so striking even now. It feels like a dog built from continuity itself, a living bridge between old labor and modern identity, between the private patience of breeders and the public language of official recognition. It survived because people kept seeing value in what it could do, and because its form kept saying the same thing in every place it went. Some histories end when they are recognized. The Weimaraners did something rarer. Recognition let it begin again, on a larger map, without forgetting where it came from. If you found this history of the Weimaraner as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments. What breed should we uncover next?